the South in American history. To speak of this section of the country, historically, is a major undertaking. In contrast to much of the rest of the country, of course, particularly vis-a-vis the North, we see such great differences, despite the fact of speaking of one nation. Much of the story has to do with climate, with the lay of the land, and with the development of economic and social institutions that will make the South, for better or for worse, very distinctive in our history. The Southeast, as well as the Northeast, were woodlands. Indians had settled thousands of years before, organized various tribal societies, some hunting tribes, some farming tribes, some peaceful tribes, some warlike tribes, in what we call the southern part of the United States, with their own families of languages, and all that could be describing Indian culture. To speak of the Southern War, the Civil War, and we can use that term to be sure. The South would prefer terms like the war between the states, the war for Southern independence. Those terms have a certain edge to them. Is to speak of the various advantages and the disadvantages the North and the South had. And to list them is to understand ultimately why the North won and the South lost. During the war, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln on January 1st, 1863. And that proclamation is often, in one's mind, seen simply as the emancipation of the slaves. But as historians have pointed out, we need to look more carefully at what the Emancipation Proclamation said and what it did not say, as far as the slaves are concerned. In fact, it declared free those slaves in the Confederate States. But not all the slave states had left the Union. Those border slave states that remained in the Union, occupied by Union Army troops, I might add, slaves were not freed. Or as one historian argued, where the United States had no control over the issue, it declared the slaves free. Where the United States did have control over the situation, it did not free them. In that sense, not a single slave was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. So what is its importance? Its importance primarily was as a military document. That is to say, it allowed for the first time blacks to serve in the Union Army. Before then, they did various servile duties, digging graves, serving officers, digging latrines, and all of that. Blacks generally wanted very much to serve. For them, it was a cause to call their own in terms of their freedom. Emancipation Proclamation allowed them to serve. Under white officers, to be sure, suffering all kinds of segregation as far as the Union Army was concerned. But fight they did. Sometimes they were cannon fodder, that is to say the point of attacks, drawing fire first. Or in the case of Fort Wagner, a black regiment formed in Massachusetts, fighting an impossible situation and suffering enormous casualties. But fight they did. And by the end of the war, there was up to 250,000 blacks under arms by the end of the Civil War. And with the settlement of these colonies, blacks arrived very early in the story. In the case of Virginia, settled in 1607 by the English, the first blacks arrived in Jamestown in 1619. The bringing over of labor, either in terms of from West Africa or from England itself, followed initially a pattern of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?